11 days. That's how long it took Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward to sail his carrier battle group from Portsmouth into a shooting war at the bottom of the world. 11 days from the moment HMS Hermes cast off her lines in Portsmouth Harbor, with thousands standing on the dock in April rain, to the moment his ships crossed into range of an enemy that had more aircraft, more missiles, and the advantage of fighting close to home. The Americans watching from Washington assessed the British chances with the cold precision of professionals. The U.S. Navy, the largest and most technologically advanced fleet on Earth, ran the numbers. Argentina had over 200 frontline combat aircraft. Britain had 28 Sea Harriers split between two aging carriers. The island sat 8,000 miles from the United Kingdom. There was no airborne early warning, no long-range fighter cover, no realistic possibility of resupply if the losses mounted. A senior American naval officer summarized the consensus view in a single sentence that circulated through the Pentagon. A British counter-invasion of the Falkland Islands was a military impossibility. In early May 1982, as British ships were taking their first hits from Argentine missiles in the South Atlantic, U.S. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger authorized an extraordinary offer. An American amphibious assault ship, USS Guam, an Iwo Jima-class vessel capable of operating Sea Harriers, would be placed on standby for the Royal Navy. If Britain lost one of its two precious carriers, a replacement would be available. The offer was genuine, made by a man who had already been sending the British everything he could. Sidewinder missiles straight from factory production lines, satellite intelligence that Washington officially denied providing, fuel tankers, secure communications. Weinberger believed in the special relationship so completely that he was willing to put American naval assets into a war zone to keep his ally in the fight. Sandy Woodward noted the offer. He filed it away. He never called it in. That decision, to fight this war with British ships, British aircraft, British blood, and British command decisions, regardless of what the Americans were prepared to provide, is the true story of the Falklands. It is a story about what happens when a nation that has been quietly told by budget committees and defense reviews and the comfortable assumptions of the Cold War that it is no longer a first-rank military power decides to prove otherwise. It is a story about a commander operating on a razor's edge, losing ships he couldn't replace, watching his margin for error disappear with every Argentine airstrike, and choosing deliberately, not under orders, not from arrogance, but from strategic calculation, to win this thing himself. And it is a story about the gap between what a military force looks like on paper and what it actually is when someone pushes it into the South Atlantic in autumn and tells it to do the impossible. The background to the war begins not with Argentina's invasion on April 2, 1982, but with a decade of British defense decisions that had been systematically stripping the Royal Navy of the very capabilities it was now going to need. Throughout the 1970s, successive British governments had concluded that the next major war would be fought in Central Europe against the Soviet Union. The Navy's role in that scenario was primarily anti-submarine warfare. Hunting Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic approaches to ensure American reinforcement could flow to NATO. Carriers, amphibious capability, power projection far from the British Isles. These were expensive luxuries in a Cold War calculus that had already put Britain's nuclear deterrent on submarines and assumed that any major conflict would be a continental one. The 1981 Defense Review, authored by Secretary of State John Nott, took these assumptions to their logical conclusion. HMS Hermes, the 30-year-old fleet carrier that would become Woodward's flagship in the South Atlantic, was scheduled to be sold. HMS Invincible, just commissioned, was also earmarked for sale to Australia. The amphibious assault ships, HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid, the workhorses of any major amphibious operation, were to be decommissioned. The Royal Marines' 3 Commando Brigade, The force that would ultimately storm San Carlos water was under threat of significant reduction. Had General Leopoldo Galtieri's military junta in Buenos Aires waited just 12 months before ordering the invasion of the Falkland Islands, there would have been no credible British military response. The ships required to carry one would have been sold, scrapped, or laid up in reserve. The 1981 Defense Review had, in effect, established a closing window of opportunity for any nation willing to seize a British overseas territory by force. Argentina walked through that window on April 2, 1982, but they had 1 year less to spare than they knew. Galtieri and his junta were not stupid men making a random gamble. They had watched British defense policy carefully and concluded that Britain would not fight. The Falklands were remote, expensive to defend, and home to fewer than 2,000 people. The United States had been cultivating Argentina as a valued Cold War partner in Latin America, assisting the junta's anti-communist operations in the region. Galtieri calculated that Washington would prevent London from responding militarily, and that even if Britain attempted something, the political will would collapse before significant forces could be committed. Argentina had bought the Super Étendard strike aircraft and AM-39 Exocet anti-ship missiles from France and had modern British-built Type 42 destroyers. Its Air Force operated over 200 frontline aircraft from bases less than 400 miles from the islands. Britain would have to fight at the end of an 8,000-mile supply line with no established bases in the southern hemisphere against an enemy who had home advantage in the air. The junta was not wrong about the military geography. It was wrong about Margaret Thatcher. On March 31, 1982, as Argentine invasion preparations reached their final stage, Chief of the Naval Staff Admiral Sir Henry Leach drove to the House of Commons to speak to the Prime Minister directly. The message he delivered changed the course of the crisis. He told Thatcher that he could assemble a naval task force capable of retaking the Falklands, and that it could be ready to sail within days. He told her it would be extraordinarily difficult and genuinely risky, and he told her it could be done. Leach had made the journey to Parliament partly out of frustration. Other voices in the room that evening had been counseling caution, exploring diplomatic options, running through the formidable list of obstacles. Leach believed that if the Navy did not go now, it would never have the capability to go at all. The ships were there. The men were trained. But the window was measured in months, not years. Thatcher authorized the task force's assembly on April 2nd, the same day Argentine forces raised the Argentine flag over Port Stanley. HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible sailed from Portsmouth on the 5th of April, 1982, accompanied by destroyers, frigates, submarines, Royal Fleet auxiliary supply ships, and a growing list of requisitioned civilian vessels pressed into service as troop transports, supply ships, and improvised aircraft carriers. The Queen Elizabeth II, at 67,000 tons, one of the largest ocean liners in the world, would carry 3,200 troops south. The container ship Atlantic Conveyor would carry additional Harrier aircraft and Chinook helicopters lashed to her deck. The luxury cruise liner Canberra would transport 40 Commando Royal Marines and 3 para from England to war. The speed of the mobilization was breathtaking. The Royal Navy had not conducted a major opposed amphibious operation since the Suez Crisis in 1956, and Suez had been a political and military disaster that had defined British strategic humiliation for a generation. Now, in a matter of days, the fleet was loading ammunition, calibrating fire control systems, briefing intelligence on Argentine order of battle, and calculating how long the transit south would take. Sandy Woodward received his orders to command the Carrier Battle Group, Task Group 317.8, while already at sea on a NATO exercise. He was 49 years old, a submariner by background who had spent most of his career beneath the surface of the ocean rather than commanding surface fleets in open water. He had, as he later admitted with characteristic candor, limited experience of air warfare, and no experience of amphibious operations at the level he was now expected to manage. His appointment over more experienced surface warfare admirals caused friction that would persist throughout the campaign. But he had something his detractors could not easily quantify: a mathematical, systematic mind that could hold the entire campaign's logistics, strategic timeline, and tactical variables in his head simultaneously, and work backward from a deadline to determine what had to happen and when. He gave himself no illusions. Writing in his memoirs about the transit south, he noted the absurdity and the necessity of what they were doing with unflinching clarity. The islands were not worth the lives that would be lost to retake them. But allowing armed aggression to succeed when Britain had the capacity to resist it was something else entirely. That could not be permitted. The Americans had watched Britain mobilize with a mixture of admiration, anxiety, and genuine strategic uncertainty. The Reagan administration was caught between two impulses that pulled in opposite directions. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, beginning a shuttle diplomacy mission between London and Buenos Aires, was pursuing a diplomatic settlement that would have prevented war. But Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger had no interest in watching an ally fail in the field when he could prevent it. From the first days of the crisis, Weinberger began quietly moving American support toward Britain. The Pentagon authorized the transfer of AIM-9L Sidewinder air to air missiles, the latest variant, far superior to anything in the British inventory, directly from production to the task force. These missiles would prove critical in the air battles to come. American intelligence satellites were repositioned to provide coverage of the South Atlantic, and their imagery, officially denied, began flowing to British commanders. The United States diverted a supertanker to replenish 2 million U.S. gallons of fuel at Ascension Island, the British-administered mid-Atlantic base that would serve as the campaign's forward staging post. American communication satellites were made available for secure British transmissions. Tanker aircraft were put on standby to assume RAF duties in Europe, freeing British aircraft for the South Atlantic. The extent of American support was systematically understated in public precisely because Haig was simultaneously presenting the United States as a neutral mediator. Reagan told the world he could not understand why two allies were fighting over, as he put it, that little ice-cold bunch of land down there. Behind the scenes, the president had directed that Britain should receive virtually anything it asked for. The operational reality was that American logistics, intelligence, and material support were deeply embedded in the British campaign. But the actual fighting, every engagement, every tactical decision, every command given under fire, remained entirely British. This was not accidental. Thatcher and her commanders had made a deliberate strategic choice to prosecute the war under British command and British authority. American direct combat support, American pilots in the air, American warships in the battle group, American uniformed personnel engaged in hostilities was never requested and never provided. The reasons were partly political. American combat involvement would have transformed the geopolitics of the conflict in ways that neither London nor Washington wanted. But they were also deeply military. Britain was fighting to prove something. Not to the Argentines, the military outcome was the vehicle, not the point. Britain was fighting to prove to itself, to its allies, and to its own defense establishment that it remained capable of projecting military force at significant range in a contested environment without the United States holding its hand. The offer of Guam as a replacement carrier was real and sincere. Woodward and his commanders understood its significance. They also understood what accepting it would mean. American personnel would have to sail with the ship. American rules of engagement, American command structures, American political constraints would enter the campaign alongside the hull. The clean British line of command from Northwood to Woodward to his task group commanders would become complicated in ways that might prove fatal in a crisis. More fundamentally, accepting an American carrier would have transformed the narrative of the war from a British military achievement into something else. Something shared, something that could be credibly claimed, at least in part, by a government in Washington that had been trying to talk both sides into a settlement right up until the bombs started falling. Woodward never formally refused the offer. He simply never used it. He would find another way. The way he found was built on three foundations: nuclear submarines, sea Harriers, and the willingness to accept losses that would have ended almost any other campaign. The first decisive act of the war was invisible to almost everyone watching it. 3 Royal Navy nuclear-powered submarines, Spartan, Splendid, and Conqueror, had arrived in the South Atlantic before the surface fleet, moving silently beneath the sea. Their presence was the campaign's hidden foundation. Argentina's navy included the aircraft carrier Ara 25 de Mayo with a 4 Skyhawk aircraft capable of launching Exocet missiles, an extraordinarily dangerous threat to Woodward's carriers. Argentina also had 2 Type 209 diesel submarines, modern and quiet, capable of closing on the task force unseen. On Tucumay, Conqueror sank the Argentine cruiser Ara General Belgrano with 2 World War II-era Mk-8 torpedoes, killing 321 of her crew. The sinking was politically controversial at home. The Belgrano was outside the total exclusion zone Britain had declared around the Falklands, and her heading at the moment of the attack was westward, apparently away from the British fleet. Woodward knew that the Belgrano's heading in any given hour told him nothing about her intentions over the following 24 hours, and that her Exocet-armed escorts were among the most dangerous vessels in the Argentine Navy. He ordered the attack, had it authorized through London, and watched from his Hermes as the signal confirmed the kill. The consequences were transformative. Argentina's entire surface fleet returned to port and stayed there for the remainder of the war. A navy that had represented a serious threat to the task force, the 25 de Mayo's aircraft alone could have fundamentally changed the balance of the air war, simply withdrew from the contest. Woodward had eliminated an entire dimension of the threat with a single attack. The sea around the Falklands belonged to Britain. But the Belgrano's sinking did not solve the problem of the air. 2 days later, on 4 May, a pair of Argentine Super-Tendered aircraft found Sheffield. The Sheffield died in a way that exposed every vulnerability the task force carried south with it. The destroyer was forward of the main battle group, serving as a radar picket, screening the carriers from exactly the kind of threat that found her. The Super-Tendereds flew at near sea level to defeat radar detection, popped briefly above the horizon to acquire the target with their own radar, fired their Exocet missiles, and turned back toward Argentina. The AM-39 Exocet flew below Sheffield's radar coverage, struck amidships at an estimated 680 miles per hour, and detonated its motor fuel rather than its warhead, a failure of detonation that should have made the strike survivable. The fire that resulted was not survivable. Sheffield was abandoned with 20 of her crew dead. She sank under tow 10 days later. Woodward had commanded Sheffield years earlier. He knew her captain. He knew men on that ship. He absorbed the news and kept working. The loss of Sheffield demonstrated something that Woodward had already understood in theory, but now understood in the most unambiguous possible terms. The task force was extraordinarily fragile. With only 2 carriers, losing either Hermes or Invincible would end the campaign. Every major ship he lost reduced his margin. And he had no reserve. There was no second task force behind him. No reinforcements that could arrive in time to matter. What he had was what he had, and it would have to be enough. This was the context in which Weinberger's offer of a replacement carrier existed. An American ship, were it to arrive after a British carrier loss, would arrive weeks later, by which time the campaign's timeline, already compressed against the approaching southern winter, would have collapsed. Woodward needed the carriers he had to survive. He could not plan around their replacement. What he could do, what he now understood he had to do, was fight smarter than the enemy could compensate for. The air battle that defined the campaign's middle phase was fought over San Carlos Water on East Falkland, a sheltered bay that British commanders had chosen as the amphibious landing site precisely because its surrounding hills provided protection against low-level air attack. The surrounding terrain that made San Carlos ideal for the landing also created problems for air defense. Ships positioned in the narrow waters had limited room to maneuver, and the hills that blocked Exocet attack also blocked the radar coverage that would have given earlier warning of incoming Argentine strike aircraft. On 21 May 1982, the Amphibious Task Group under Commodore Michael Clapp began landing 3 Commando Brigade at San Carlos. The Argentine response, when it came, was massive and brave. Argentine Air Force pilots, flying A-4 Skyhawks and EI Dagger aircraft, Israeli-built copies of the French Mirage 5, came in so low that the pilots could see the expressions of the men they were attacking. They came in at 30 meters above sea level, skimming the water at 500 miles per hour, flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from dozens of weapons simultaneously. The courage required to do this, repeatedly, knowing the losses they were sustaining, was extraordinary. And the losses they sustained were extraordinary. In the first 5 days of the San Carlos landing phase, Argentine aircraft flew over 500 sorties and lost 51 aircraft to a combination of Sea Harriers, ship-launched missiles, and small arms fire from troops on the ground. 51 aircraft in 5 days. The Argentine Air Force flew until it barely had the aircraft and pilots left to continue, and it kept flying. But the British were bleeding too. HMS Ardent was hit multiple times and sank on May 22nd. HMS Antelope was struck and sank the following day after an unexploded bomb detonated during defusal. HMS Coventry repositioned to draw fire away from other ships while a pair of Sea Wolf-equipped frigates tried to engage attackers, was bombed and sank in 24 minutes on 25th May, taking 19 of her crew. On the same day, the Atlantic Conveyor, the container ship carrying Chinook heavy-lift helicopters that were essential to the Army's plan for the ground campaign, was struck by 2 Exocet missiles and sank with the loss of her captain and 11 crew, along with 3 of the 4 Chinooks she was carrying. The loss of the Chinooks was a catastrophe for the ground campaign. The plan had been to airlift troops and equipment across East Falkland from the San Carlos bridgehead to positions within striking distance of Port Stanley. Without the Chinooks, there was only one option. The soldiers would march. And march they did. 3 Commando Brigade, carrying loads of 40, 50, and 60 kilograms per man, set out across terrain that was boggy, cold, trackless, and utterly exposed to the southern winter. 3 para marched to Teal Inlet in a single night. 45 Commando Yompt, the Royal Marines' word for a forced march with full equipment, across ground that Argentine defenders had assessed as impassable without vehicle support. The sheer physical endurance of the ground forces during this phase of the campaign has been compared, by those who study such things, to some of the most demanding military marches in British history. Woodward, watching from Hermes, understood what the loss of Sheffield and the San Carlos ships meant in the wider strategic picture. He understood that his force was fighting at a level of intensity that could not be sustained indefinitely. But he also understood that the Argentine Air Force was burning itself out, making that intensity possible. Every aircraft lost over San Carlos was an aircraft that could not fly again. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable in the time frame that mattered. Britain was losing ships, Argentina was losing the air war, and the 2 losses were not equivalent. The mathematics, brutal as they were running in Britain's favor. The air balance was shifting for another reason that deserves detailed attention, because it illuminates something profound about preparation, doctrine, and the invisible advantages that only reveal themselves under fire. The Sea Harrier was not supposed to be able to fight the Argentine Air Force's Mirage 3 and Dagger aircraft. It was slower than both. Its radar was not designed for the air-to-air mission. Its range was limited. American assessments before the war had placed it at a significant disadvantage against the Argentine jets in any conventional dogfight. What those assessments had not fully accounted for was the combination of the AIM-9L Sidewinder missile, provided by Weinberger from American production, and a maneuvering technique that the Harrier's vertical thrust vectoring made uniquely possible. The AIM-9L was an all-aspect missile. Where previous Sidewinder variants required the launching aircraft to approach from behind the target to attack from the engine's heat signature, the Lima variant could be fired from almost any angle and would still find the target. This transformed the geometry of air combat. Argentine pilots had developed their tactics around defeating missiles that had to be launched from the rear quarter. The Lima variant made those tactics irrelevant. The Sea Harrier pilots who flew them had trained extensively for exactly this kind of close-range turning combat. At the moment of engagement, the Harrier's thrust vectoring allowed it to decelerate rapidly in the middle of a turning fight, a maneuver called viffing, vectoring in forward flight, forcing pursuing aircraft to overshoot. The Argentine pilots, encountering this technique in combat for the first time, found that the aircraft they were chasing had suddenly turned into a threat behind them. The result was one of the most lopsided air-to-air kill ratios in modern aviation history. Over the course of the entire campaign, Sea Harriers shot down 20 Argentine aircraft in air-to-air combat. Not one Sea Harrier was lost to enemy aircraft in the air. 0. An aircraft that the best American and Argentine pre-war analysis had assessed as outmatched by the Argentine jets achieved 20 kills for 0 air-to-air losses. Woodward noted this with the satisfaction of a man whose plan depended on the Sea Harrier performing far above expectation. The carriers had to be protected. The carriers were protected, not by American support assets, not by airborne early warning aircraft Britain didn't have, not by technological superiority, because Britain didn't have that either, but by 28 pilots who had trained to perfection in close-range combat and who flew their aircraft at the absolute limit of its capability every single day. The ground campaign that followed the San Carlos landing was prosecuted with a speed that surprised even its commanders. Brigadier Julian Thompson's 3 Commando Brigade fought the Battle of Goose Green on 28-29 May, where Tucumparra under Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones assaulted an Argentine garrison that outnumbered them roughly 2-1 and won in a night battle that cost Jones his life at the head of his men. He was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, the first of 2 awarded in the campaign, the second going to Sergeant Ian Mackay of 3 Para at the Battle of Mount Longdon. The fighting for the hills around Port Stanley in the first 2 weeks of June, Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Mount Harriet, Wireless Ridge, Tumbledown, was done in darkness, at close quarters, with fixed bayonets. The Scots Guards stormed Mount Tumbledown against Argentine Special Forces who had dug in for a last, determined stand. The Gurkhas cleared Mount William in a night assault that ended Argentine organized resistance on that feature in under an hour. The Parachute Regiment, having already marched from San Carlos to Teal Inlet and fought at Goose Green, attacked Wireless Ridge and broke through. On June 14, 1982, Argentine General Mario Menendez surrendered to Major General Jeremy Moore in Port Stanley. 74 days after the invasion, the Falkland Islands were British again. The British had lost 255 military personnel, 2 destroyers, Sheffield and Coventry, 2 frigates, Ardent and Antelope. The landing ship Sir Galahad attacked with devastating effect at Fitzroy on 8th of June, killing 48 men, 32 of them Welsh guardsmen waiting to disembark. The Atlantic Conveyor, 10 Harrier aircraft, though none to enemy aircraft in the air, 24 helicopters. The material losses were significant, and had they fallen differently, particularly if either of the carriers had been struck, they would have been catastrophic. Argentina lost 649 military personnel. 321 of them died on the Belgrano. Their Air Force lost over 100 aircraft total, including 55 to air-to-air combat and anti-aircraft fire. Their Navy never left port after the Belgrano's sinking. The ground forces, many of them young conscripts who had begun their military training only months before the invasion, were outfought by professional soldiers in conditions that would have challenged even the best-trained troops in the world. What the United States learned from watching this is perhaps as important as the war itself. The lessons began arriving in Washington while the fighting was still going on. The Pentagon commissioned a detailed after-action review, Lessons of the Falklands, that was delivered to Caspar Weinberger in February 1983. The review was classified but subsequently discussed in congressional hearings and partially published. It covered naval warfare, air combat, amphibious operations, logistics, and command and control. Many of its findings were sobering for the U.S. Navy. The vulnerability of modern warships to anti-ship missiles was not a new theoretical concern, but the Falklands demonstrated it at operational scale for the first time since the Second World War. Aluminium superstructures that burned, damage control procedures that had been drilled in peacetime but had never been tested by actual fires caused by actual weapons. The danger of ships operating without adequate close-in defense against sea-skimming missiles. The devastating effect of unexploded bombs on fire control and command systems even when they failed to detonate. Ships that had been designed for Cold War scenarios operating in the North Atlantic under substantial air cover from NATO aircraft were shown to be seriously exposed in a scenario where that air cover did not exist. The absence of airborne early warning was particularly noted. Without AEW aircraft, the Falklands carriers were too small to operate the heavy aircraft required. The task force was perpetually blind to low-level threats until they were almost upon it. The Sea Harriers were effective, but they were not the same as AEW, and the gaps in coverage cost British ships that might have been saved with earlier warning. The lesson was not lost on either the Royal Navy, which subsequently developed the Sea King AEW helicopter, or on the U.S. Navy, which used the Falklands as a powerful argument for maintaining its own full-size carrier fleet and the Hawkeye AEW aircraft that went with it. The AIM-9L Sidewinder's performance was studied closely. Its all-aspect capability had fundamentally changed the terms of close-range air combat, and its role in the Sea Harrier's extraordinary kill ratio validated the American decision to provide it to Britain. What it also validated more broadly was the principle that weapon quality can compensate to a significant degree for numerical inferiority, a lesson with obvious implications for NATO planning in a scenario where Soviet numbers would always dwarf Western aircraft inventories. The amphibious lessons were studied extensively by the U.S. Marine Corps. The speed of the British mobilization, from the decision to mount the operation to troops on the beach in less than 45 days, was considered remarkable for a force that had not conducted a major amphibious operation in 26 years. The flexibility with which civilian ships were requisitioned and converted, the improvisation that produced a working forward base at Ascension Island in a matter of days, the willingness of commanders to accept risk in conditions of significant uncertainty. These were qualities that American amphibious planners found instructive and somewhat humbling. Sandy Woodward spent the rest of his life thinking about the Falklands. He retired as an admiral in 1989 and died in August 2013. In the years between, he wrote with extraordinary frankness about what had happened and what it meant. He was blunt about how close the campaign had come to failure. He said in interviews and in the revised edition of his memoir that had General Mendez been able to extend the ground campaign by 10 more days, the approaching southern winter would have forced the British fleet to withdraw. The task force's endurance was not unlimited. The weather window that made amphibious operations possible was closing. The aircraft were accumulating wear at rates that could not be sustained. The losses in ships had degraded the fleet's air defense coverage to a point where Woodward was genuinely uncertain how much more it could absorb. He described the campaign as a fairly close-run thing, and those words from the man who commanded it carry a weight that statistics cannot convey. What made it succeed were the Americans, and by his own admission, many in his own fleet, thought it would fail was not superior technology. Britain's equipment was in many cases older and less capable than Argentina's. It was not numerical advantage. Argentina had more aircraft, more men on the ground, and fought close to home. It was not assured American support because Woodward never called in the offers that would have made that support explicit and direct. What it was this: a military culture that understood how to function when the support systems weren't there. Damage control parties who kept ships fighting. Pilots who flew more sorties per day than their aircraft were supposed to be capable of sustaining. Ground troops who marched 80 miles across moorland at the bottom of the world, carrying everything they owned on their backs, and then went straight into a night assault on fortified positions. Submarine commanders who spent weeks in the South Atlantic operating alone, 8,000 miles from the nearest friendly port, without the command and control infrastructure that modern navies considered essential. The Falklands worked because the people who fought it had been built by a training system and a military culture that traced its roots back through generations of professional soldiering to function under conditions that would have paralyzed less prepared forces. The American carrier was there if Woodward had needed it. He never needed it. There is a final thread in this story that is rarely examined as closely as it deserves. When the 1981 Knott Defense Review had proposed scrapping his Hermes and selling's Invincible to Australia, it was doing so on the basis of a strategic calculation that Britain would never again need to project military power in the South Atlantic or anywhere comparable. That calculation was not unreasonable given the Cold War strategic landscape. It was, as events proved within months, spectacularly wrong. Britain fought the Falklands War with ships that were on their way to being sold. Hermes had been scheduled to leave Royal Navy service. Invincible was sold to Australia, a sale that was suspended when the crisis began. The amphibious ships, Fearless and Intrepid, also under the Axe, went south and landed 3 Commando Brigade at San Carlos Water. After the war, the defense cuts that had preceded it were reconsidered. Not reversed, British defense budgets remained constrained throughout the 1980s, but reconsidered. The case for carrier aviation, which the Royal Navy had been losing to Treasury economists for a decade, was suddenly and undeniably made. The case for amphibious capability was made with equal force. The argument that Britain had no need of a blue water navy capable of operating beyond NATO's European boundaries was answered definitively by 255 dead and a flag flying over Port Stanley. Woodward spoke about this in his later years with a clarity that cut through the comfortable narratives that surrounded the Falklands in British memory. He pointed out that as the Royal Navy's capabilities had continued to shrink in the decades after 1982, carriers decommissioned, amphibious ships laid up, escort numbers falling, the ability to repeat the campaign was quietly eroding. He said publicly, years before his death, that by the time he was speaking, Britain could not retake the Falklands if they were invaded again. The force that had done it in 1982 no longer existed in the form required. That assessment, from the man who had actually done it, is perhaps the most important thing the Falklands War tells us about the relationship between military capability and the decisions made in peacetime to preserve or destroy it. Weinberger's offer of an American carrier was not a threat to British independence. It was a safety net that a professional and clear-eyed British commander chose not to use, because using it would have changed what the campaign was and what it proved. What it proved was that Britain could do this, could reach 8,000 miles, fight in conditions of significant material and numerical disadvantage, absorb losses that would have ended most modern campaigns, and win. That proof cost 255 lives and an unknown number of years from the lives of those who came back carrying things that war leaves in people. But the proof stands. And behind it, the silhouette of an American warship that sat at readiness and was never needed. A measure as precise as any statistic of what the Royal Navy was prepared to become when the world made its demands. Sandy Woodward sailed south with what he had. He fought with what he had. He won with what he had. And what he had, it turned out, was enough.